And then do you want to talk about Benedict's shame as well? Because that felt very Dostoevskian to me as well.
Yeah, it's also connected with language, isn't it? And how you talk about yourself. The word wstyd in Polish, I mean, I've translated it as shame. It is that, but it's also something else. Well, and there's not really a good equivalent word because it's sort of embarrassment. It's not just shame, in the sense of shame of what I've done or not done. But it's a sort of general sort of shyness and an intense embarrassment of just being what you are.
Hello, and welcome back to the Big Book Project. My name is Lori Feathers, and I'm thrilled today to have joining me the translator Ursula Phillips. And she's here to talk to us about her translation of this mighty tome, Ice, by Jacek Dukaj, and it's translated from the Polish. Welcome, Ursula.
Thank you for having me.
Really happy to have you here. Um, we're going to get into a really wonderful uh, translator's postscript that you've written for the book, and some of the problems and challenges of translating this book beyond its amazing length of about 1,200 pages. But maybe we'll get started with just a brief sketch of our protagonist here, Benedykt Gierosławski, a mathematician in Warsaw, Poland, and a little bit about the plot and his search for his father.
Yes, well, I'm not quite sure where to start with talking about the plot, because the starting point for Jacek was really an essay originally written in 1913 by the philosopher Tadeusz Kotabinski. And its call, the translation would be Problems of the Existence of the Future. And it sort of covers two main problems. One is about how you talk about the past and about the future logically, and how you find a suitable language for talking logically about this sort of thing. And it evolves into a discussion, which was one of the main discussions amongst this group of philosophers, of which Kotabinski was a part, called the Lvov, which is, I can explain while we're using Lvov, not Lviv, later if you like, the Lvov Warsaw School of Mathematicians and Logicians. And the theme that they were most interested in was about different types of logic, between so-called two-valued logic and three-valued logic. And three-valued logic is basically the world in which we live, where, things are not necessarily either true or false. There are loads of possibilities and arguments, and, we can be multiple. And two-valued logic is a worldview that sort of sees things in absolute terms. It's either this or it's that. It's either true or it's false. And Jacek's fascinated by this subject, and he wondered about what this two-valued logic would look like if it was made material, if it was introduced into the material world in which we live, and how life would change. And he wanted to set this exploration really in the time of Kotabinski himself. So we're talking, beginning of the 20th century. And he alighted upon the Tunguska meteor event as being the inspiration for an imaginative change to reality. So the event, as you know, was an actual event. Something, probably a meteor, fell over Irkutsk. It may or may not have hit the ground. In the book, it does hit the ground. And it caused enormous, probably nuclear, a sort of an event of nuclear size, where light was seen in as far away as in London. Yeah, so he imagines this as bringing a particular substance from outer space and changing the physics. When it hits the ground, it changed the physics. And this is in the sense that instead of everything that reacts, whether it's chemical reactions, whether it's entropy, whether it's thermodynamics, everything changes from energy and heat to cold and entropy and negentropy. So it goes from it's the opposite, or rather the negation of what we would normally expect in a chemical reaction. So this is the kind of thinking behind the changes to the environment in Siberia. So it just gets colder and colder and colder, and generally things start to obey this logic of either or, yeah, this or that, and it affects everything, not just what he calls the black physics, but chemistry, biology, and eventually the human mind. So thinking freely, as we see in the book, as they get to Irkutsk, becomes more difficult and more or less impossible. And Tesla, thinks up ways, or a way in which to sort of overcome this problem so they can still think. So basically, winter in the novel is represented by the ice and by the two valued logic and everything that comes from it, whether it's physical or whether it's philosophical or anything. And summer is a general comment, a general description for everything that we know as it is now. Yeah. So the basic plot follows the journey of this young mathematician, Gierosławski. So he's variously called, as you've noticed, by his proper Polish name, which is Benedykt Gierosławski, or it gets Russianized, Benedykt Gierosławski. And we can talk about why there's a Russian environment for this. But, when he's addressed by Russians, talked about by Russians, they use the Russian form. And when he's just himself, and he's amongst Poles, he's his normal Gierosławski. And he is sent, or he's kidnapped first of all, or taken by the opening scene. The officials, the chinovniks, the officials of the Ministry of Winter in Warsaw. We were talking about the wider context now of Russian Poland, when Poland was still partitioned. So this is a sort of Russian type imperialist ministry, completely authoritarian, and he's taken to the ministry, and he is sent to Siberia to look for his father. And this is where it has sort of a few parallels with the Odyssey, of course. Yeah, he's sent in search of his father, who was originally an exile from the Polish uprising against the Russians in 1863. And while he's been there, it's correction. There were a lot of people like him, but he was obviously part of a later imagined rebellion, yeah, because of his age. He's obviously must have been born around the 1880s. Anyway, that's beside the point. But the point about this Gierosławski Senior is that he seems to have gone rogue, in the sense that he's gone into the wild, and he was formerly a geologist, so he'd been doing a lot of research. First of all, he'd been a prisoner, and then he stayed there, as most of these exiles had to. He became a scientist, and was studying all these things, and then they think, or they imagine, that because he seems to have gone out into the wilds and become a sort of iceman, that he communicates with the ice. And so they want to find out, because there's politics and all kinds of things associated with this. They want to find out what's going on in this Siberia with this bloke and all the the political turmoil. So he's bribed to go, and because he, as a student, he was also in a lot of debt for his um, card playing and debts. He is easily bribed, and so he is sent and he agrees to go, and so he goes on the so that's the first part is basically one long chapter set in Warsaw, and Jacek very cleverly in this part introduces a lot of characters, a lot of themes, about language use, about philosophy, about existence, as well as the sort of political and religious themes that he's wanting to look at. Yeah, so he very cleverly introduces all this in this first part. Second part is when he's on the train, and he's on the Trans-Siberian Express, the luxurious carriages of it, which he makes even more luxurious than they actually were. And he's in a sort of society of international society of rich travellers, and amongst them is Nikola Tesla, who is going on. He never actually went, of course, but in this book he does go to Russia. So all these sort of scientific things start to develop. They observe how the landscape changes, how it gets colder and colder as they're going towards the ice, and Tesla and he are discussing all kinds of scientific issues of the day. And then the next part, which is the biggest part 3, is set in Irkutsk, where we see all the results of the ice and the scientific developments that have taken place, the technologies that have been developed, and all the industries that people are making a lot of money out of in Irkutsk. And this is, has been described as steampunk. It reminded me very much of H.G. Wells, and some of these at that time when people were thinking of these other worlds and other, architectures, and it's just a fantastic, beautiful, astounding world that is created there. And Benedykt gets caught up here in all kinds of political events as well, which force him to flee in the end. And then the final section is basically out in Siberia, where he meets up with Pilsudski, and who's Polish politician, who at that stage is actually running a terrorist group, basically, a group of Polish nationalists who are out in Siberia, and they're called Japonczyks, which is derived from the Russian word for Japan, Japonia, because they're fighting on the Japanese side against the Tsarist thing. So that's basically the structure. Yeah, so he's going from Warsaw, where he's from. He was studying. There's the long section on the train, and then there's an even longer section where he's in Irkutsk, and everything happens like that. And then there's the denouement. But I'm not going to be a spoiler about that. So sorry about that. It was very long, wasn't it?
Well, you were very succinct because it's a very complex plot. One of the things in the book that's so amazing is this complex broil of political factions, religious factions, commercial interests. Maybe you can tell us a bit about the Gleason and how the ice manifests itself and the commercial interests in dealing with that.
Yeah, Gleason.
Gleason, excuse me.
Gleason, yeah. Well, yeah, this was a word I made up. It's the original word is lute, and I'll just explain a bit about that, because knowing Russian, you'll appreciate this. In Polish, it's spelled Luty, and it's actually the modern word for February. But a luty, it's an adjective. It works as an adjective. lute and lute for the plural. And they are basically emanations of the ice that move. Massive grand structures. I mean, in the first chapter, first few pages, they encounter one when he's on the way with these functionaries for the ministry. They get stuck in traffic, which has been caused chaos by one, and they can come up out of the ground, or they can move across the roofs. And they are vast, very threatening, sometimes black, emanations of ice that seem to be alive. But they're not actually alive, but people think they're creatures because they don't get it yet, you know. But it becomes explained later on when he's in Irkutsk how these things move, and it's purely scientific. There's a scientific, but so he calls this alute, and this is harks back to an old Slavonic word which still exists in Russian, lyute, which means cruel or very severe, and you can use it of frost and things like that. So it's got those kind of connotations, but when you hear it in Polish, it actually, when you listen to it, it contains the word lód, ice, which in Polish is written L with a crossed O, D, but it's devoiced, so it comes out as lód. So it's contained within luty. And this is not, from the sound point of view, it's not etymologically related, but I wanted to preserve that in some way. I wanted a word that sounded hard, and I felt that Gleis, it sort of contains ice, the sound of ice, and it relates to glacier, other words, forgotten them now, but there are several other words that begin with G related to ice. So glaciation, things like that. So the reason why I chose a Germanic sounding, it's not German. There is a word Gleis with one S, which means something completely different, but with a double S, it doesn't exist in German. It's just Germanic sounding, like Unlicht, yeah. And German seemed appropriate because I wanted to make it sound really quite threatening and foreign, unusual, different, because that is the language in which the international community communicate on the train. And he makes this point several times. You know, they don't speak Russian or French or English, they speak German. So, you know, when he sees these things, when he talks about these things, you know, because the whole thing is a kind of retrospective memory. It seemed that a German was a good sort of, or something Germanic sounded right, yeah. So then the plural becomes Gleisen, and the people that have been, you know, touched by one and therefore somehow made immune to them are the Gleiseniks. So I'm using a Russian sort of ending there, Gleiseniks. Sorry, I've forgotten your question now. You wanted to know...
The amazing cold of this ice, these ice formations, and the industries that had to come up.
Yeah. Well, the main element the element that comes from outer space is called Tungetitan, and that is the name that Tesla gives it, and I've kept that. It's in Latin, yeah, Tungetitan. And this stuff is that, as I said, you know, it reacts with things and creates cold rather than heat, but it also affects other elements. So if a glice passes through something, or reacts in some way with it, it becomes very, very hard and cold. And one of these substances is what's called cold iron. And in Polish, this is gimnazo. which is a combination of zimny, which means cold, and żelazo, which means iron. So I've put them together as he did, shortened them and put them together. So you've got cold iron, and this iron that's been affected by the glice is so hard you can do almost anything with it. And so they build these enormous structures, railways above the ground. And then there's that fantastic description of the governor's ice palace out in the forest, which is built on this sort of structure of iron, which is, and then there's the head of the industrial companies, yeah, Bobby Nostov, who lives at the top of one of these great towers, and it's made of this stuff, so it's really, really super strong. So this means that this stuff can be sold around the world. The industrialists there can be made very rich. Now, there are also other things. Perhaps the other most interesting one is the one he calls froster glaze, which is a kind of glass substance, which has been affected by glycine and by the ice. Super hard, yeah, and super resistant, and so it can stand the very, very cold temperatures and can be used for all kinds of things. And the people wear these kind of specs, or goggles made out of them, which enables them to see, and the light is affected by it, and they see beautiful colors and everything through it. So that, these are the kinds of things. And so by selling a lot of these scientific ideas and technologies, Irkutsk has become a very, very rich, wealthy place. So much so that people can afford to import from the West, from Western Europe, from Paris and from New York and everything. They can, all the latest fashions, all the latest, gadgetry, and people live a life of luxury, really. And it's interesting, the ethnic mix of this, because a lot of the people who are of this merchant class are Poles, and a lot of the scientists are Poles. So although the general political framework is of autocracy, the Russian Empire, the suppression of Polish culture, and all the rest of it, and the exile of the Poles to Katorga in Siberia. On the other hand, I think Jacek has moved on from that, because he has shown how in the Russian Empire, Poles got everywhere. Poles could, they were part of government, they were part of this kind of, industrialization, and a lot of Poles actually built the Siberian Railway. So there's this merchant class in Siberia, in Irkutsk, are largely Poles. They are largely Poles, and if you remember, there is the scene where he goes to their annual meeting, and they hear about, how they're all getting on, and they get involved in movements or some of them get involved in the movement for Siberian independence. And this actually happened. This was because we can talk about this. If you have some questions on this, how he mixes what actually happened, attested history, with his imagination. But everything is entirely credible because it could have happened, because it happened before, or something similar happened before. So, the political developments that happen, like the scientific ones, because he bases it on real science and then develops it in a sort of logical way, it's completely credible. So when you read it, you're not thinking, well, you couldn't possibly have that kind of thing happen, or you couldn't possibly have that kind of material, or, oh, the politicians wouldn't have done that, or the religious people were far too extreme. No. It's all based on what has already been, but it's just taken into another dimension. But what we haven't I haven't mentioned, I'm sorry, is that the alternative history aspect of this.
Yes, we're in
Because
1924, but the
we're 1924, but read 1908, because he also uses the Tunguska event as the moment when history stops or history freezes. Because as I was saying, the effects of the impact is not of this, thing from outer space and the changes to the physics. It's not just about physics, it's about the human mind as well, the human brain, and history, therefore. And he then, also gets into these contemporary debates and takes them in different tangents, of course, about the nature of history. And Nikolai Berdyaev, of course, is one of the inspirations, but there were others, people who, what is history? How does it happen? Is it made by individuals? Is it made by men, or is it by God, or is it necessity? These kind of questions come up a lot. So in 1908, when this thing crashed, he sees that as the moment history changes. So anything that happened up until 1908, like, for example, that very long description by a captain, a sea captain, about the Russo-Japanese War and the Battle of Tsushima, when the Russian fleet was destroyed by the Japanese, 1905. All that happened. But as the background to the events of the novel, there have been at least two more Russo-Japanese wars, and there's one going on at the time in the fictive present. So after 1908, he uses his imagination to present an alternative reality. And in this alternative reality, there's been no First World War. So there's been no First World War, there's been no Russian Revolution, Poland has not become an independent state. It's still a part of the Russian Empire, or the other two empires, Prussia or Austria. Franz Ferdinand was never killed, so he is in Vienna on the throne there. So the Tsarist autocracy continues, and Nikolai II Alexandrovich, as I call him, there's a reason why I use these Russian names and not Nicholas II. He's still in power, and this whole Tsarist structure, with their secret police, the Okhrana, and the Cossacks that kill people, who demonstrate or whatever, all that stuff just continues. Yeah. So the book starts in July 1924, and it's summer, of course, in Warsaw, but it's snow on the ground because of the ice. And the hero, Benedykt, he is an enfant du siècle, so he is the same age as the century. So he's 24. Yeah. And then the action seems to cover about the next 6 years or so. It's a bit difficult to decide, because he's keeping, as he's describing the events on the train and then in Irkutsk, he's keeping note of the date. And then when he goes out into Siberia, it becomes a bit more vague. And then in the final chapters, we don't actually know what the date is, but you can sort of work out that it's probably around 1930 in this alternative reality.
And is the piece about Tsar Nicholas II uh, aspiring that the Trans-Siberian Railway will extend to Alaska? Is that piece true?
There was a lot of talk about that. Yes, there was at the time when it first, was mooted, but it never happened. That never happened. I think he even talks about the company that was set up to perhaps do this, but I can't remember the date when when Alaska was sold to America. I can't remember the date, but it never happened. That was never built, that railway. But the Harriman Company, wasn't it? I mean, there was something yeah, there was definitely speculation that that could happen.
And in the book, the Tsar wants a thaw. He wants to find a way to end this ice age in Siberia.
Well, it's all very ambiguous and all very mixed up and contradictory. Because yes, he seems, because his own personal power is challenged by the ice, because the ice is encroaching. But on the other hand, he represents as a very almost an ice-like regime himself. So who is a so-called Liedniak, which is derived from the Russian word liednik, yeah, Ledniak, supporters of the ice, people who are supporting the status quo under the ice, of this two-valued logic of yes or no, truth or falsehood, right or wrong. Or the people that support Thor, who are called Atapielniks, from Otapiel, which is the Russian word for Thor. I've kept these phrases because these terms because I thought they were quite powerful, and because he uses a lot of Russian. I mean, Jacek uses a lot of Russian himself in the narrative. So yeah, I mean, there are various groups who want Thor, and there are various groups who want to keep the ice. But it's a little more complicated than saying the Tsar is on one side, because on the one side, as far as Benedykt and all preparers, the people that support summer, I mean, where Benedykt stands, of course, is very interesting because he changes, or he potentially changes throughout the book as he comes closer to the epicenter of the ice. He changes, and how it ends, of course, is also very ambiguous. And when I translated it, my interpretation of the end was quite different from Jacek's.
Uh-huh. Well, we probably can't get into that because that would be giving the ending away, right?
No, we can't give the ending away. No, and I think, well, the thing is, that's a sign of a good book, isn't it?
No, totally.
You can get into it, and you can agree with this, and you can agree with that. You can follow various things, and you can see that it's all very, very, very complicated.
Yeah. I want to, if listeners are confused or their heads swimming with these characters, these terms, there are very helpful glossaries in the back of the novel.
Yes. Well, well, yes, we decide. I mean, Jacek was very against this because he feels that the readers should engage. He writes for readers who are prepared to engage, and he felt that I was explaining too much. So well, there were no glosses in the text, but the publisher, I think wisely, decided we should have a glossary of terms, because there are at least, well, at least I counted, at least when I read it through, 400 neologisms, although some are derived from others. Yeah. So we felt that, yeah, well, there should be, the main ones should be given a little explanation, a little gloss in a glossary. But I also included in the glossary the Russian terms that I'd kept. Because, do you want me to talk about that, or is it very, very too complicated?
No, I'd like to hear it. I think other listeners would too.
Yeah. And ditto with all the characters. Yeah, because I mean, not everybody is included in that, but most of the characters are. And we called it dramatis personae, but some of the people are only passively there. They're talked about rather than actually having an active role. And again, I've interspersed the real characters with the fictional ones, because within the world of the book, as with the glossary, within the world of the book, they are, the characters of the book. So wasn't going to separate the so-called real ones from the fictional ones. But some of them are not mentioned that often, or they, as I say, they don't play an active role, but it would seem to me very, very important to explain who they were to people that weren't familiar with Russian culture, like Berdyaev or Fyodorov, or there were a lot of these politicians like Stolypin, Struva, there's Rasputin, of course, Trotsky. They don't necessarily do what they did in history, because although up until 1908 they did what they did in history, and then they did all kinds of other things in the book. So shall I talk about the Russian?
Yes, please.
Yeah, because of course the book, the text is in English. This is in English, because I was commissioned to translate it from Polish into English. But the original Polish contains a lot of Russian, and it's not any old Russian. It's the sort of Russian that would have been spoken at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th centuries, that Poles living in the Polish partition would have heard on a daily basis. So things that affected anything to do with their daily lives, and just food, clothes, but also administration, education, the courts, the army, anything to do with politics and the police. Yeah, this was the language that you saw on the streets as well. So shops, would have their signs in Russian as well as in Polish, or maybe only in Russian. Yeah. After the 1863 uprising, there was a clampdown on publishing Polish in public life, Polish in in education situations. So it meant that anybody that lived in that area, in that region, they might use Polish amongst themselves, or indeed some other language like Ukrainian or Lithuanian or German, yeah, or do all the Jewish languages, Yiddish, Hebrew. All these languages were there, but the language of public life and daily life and administration and government was only Russian. So you could not but help. You would have to hear it and understand it to a certain extent, yeah. So that's how it got worked into his Polish, and what he's tried to imagine, I think, is how it would have been for somebody living there. And this is quite a challenge for somebody like myself who has studied Polish literature, because we study the pure Polish. We study all those authors that were so concerned to keep the Polish language going, that you sort of don't realise, or it's very easy to not to realise that the language that people would have heard around them was very, very different. So what I decided to do, because there was so much of this, was to actually translate it. Because you see, if you were Polish, even if you didn't know, or if you're like Jacek's readers I'm thinking of now, 2007, even if you didn't study Russian in school like they'd had to under the communists, and indeed for 200-300 years before that as well, hadn't had to study Russian, you might not know Russian, but because of the common Slavonic roots, you would understand it. You would understand what was going on, yeah. And then Jacek puts into these words, which are mostly the ones that are most prominent in the book, are the ones to do with power, the ones to do with administration, to do with government, to do with the army, to do with the way people had to deal with bureaucracy, which was massive, of course, yeah. So he transcribes them into the Latin alphabet in a way which would have been comfortable for Polish orthography or for the Polish ear. So in English it'd be different. So what I decided to do was to translate the most of it. So most of the Russian I've translated, but I've kept key concepts, key words, and I've transliterated them as we would have done at the time, at the beginning of the 20th century, according to the sort of systems that were used then. Not very accurate, but it's much more standardized now. Into a transliteration that would have been familiar to English readers or American readers as opposed to Polish ones. Yeah. So I sort of to imagine this Russian back into Cyrillic and then imagine it out again. So I think, what I've done my utmost to make clear what these terms mean in context. So as you're reading it and you come against a word like katorżnik, katorga or katorżnik, or chinovnik, or ochrannik, you can sort of see from the context what they mean. But even so, they are explained in this glossary. So yeah, that's what he does with language, and this, of course, because of there's so much of this old Russian in it, it adds to the archaism. It adds to the archaism of his language generally, which is another massive topic I had to deal with.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I loved about the novel, and maybe I'm old fashioned, but I love the fact that it feels very much like a 19th century big novel.
Yeah. Well, you asked me before in your notes about Dostoevsky.
Yes.
Well, yeah, Dostoevsky is indeed one of his inspirations. Um, because as I said, he wanted to create this world which would have been familiar or acceptable to the time of Kotovinsky. Yeah, so we're talking about the 20s or before the 20s. In fact, as I said, the key date is to 1908. So we're really talking about the very end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, rather than the 20s. Yeah. So in order, I think, to convey that atmosphere, the Russian novel, the big Russian novel, particularly Dostoevsky, also Tolstoy, Gogol, um, were the inspirations, and I used them as mine, definitely. And you can see there's lots of references to Dostoevsky, but I would emphasize to our audience that if you know Dostoevsky, if you know Tolstoy, and there's references I would say as well to Thomas Mann quite clearly. You don't have to know these things. You don't have to know these things in order to understand the book. You really don't. But they're just an added dimension, I think, for those of us that do. So, starting with Dostoevsky, as soon as I read that opening scene with his student Benedykt and his student digs, and the chinovniks come, it made me think of Raskolnikov in his garret, and there are a lot of other references to some of the names, like Porfiry. Immediately you think, well, it's quite an unusual name, and it makes you think of a kind punishment. I thought the character of Zaitsev, this Russian dissident, ex-communist, who becomes a religious fanatic, and he's also an alcoholic, and he rambles and rambles and rambles and goes on. This just seemed a character to me straight out of Dostoevsky. But there's also the thing I also noticed was, well, the language itself, and it all basically hinges on the language. These very, very long sentences, a lot of digression, and this was very difficult to preserve this kind of effect, because in Polish, as in Russian, I think, you can have a very long sentence and have a comma and start with a new subject and a new predicate without having a full stop. Well, English doesn't really tolerate that very well. And some of his sentences Jacek's sentences went on for a whole page. And I had to break it down somehow. So I've introduced a whole load of semicolons which aren't actually in the original, in order to just make it more manageable. But this seemed to me very Dostoevskian as well. lots and lots of long sentences and long digressions and sort of subclauses of subclauses and but it all adds to the general atmosphere, yeah. And then also in that first chapter, we have the scene in the ministry, and that certainly reminded me of Google. And there were lots of other when also in Irkutsk when he has to attend a ministry there, and there's the whole hierarchy of these clerks and whatever. It reminded me of Gogol, and that fantastic story, the overcoat, Chignal, and the little clerk at the bottom of the hierarchy, and he has to talk in these sort of obsequious terms, to get anything out of the next official up the hierarchy. And this kind of thing was, I thought, very very pertinent, to have used all this. It certainly does give me a feeling that I can remember from reading those big novels a long time ago.
Yeah.
So
It
I mean
also
that was one of the things that I definitely used in my own translating, to think, well, it's got to sound like this, yeah.
yeah. I was also reminded in the ministry scenes of Kafka's The Castle. This like
Uh-huh.
frustration with not being able to get in front of the right person or to figure out like what do they even want from me, that kind of thing.
Yes, and at the same time you're at their mercy.
Right. And then do you want to talk about Benedict's shame as well? Because that felt very Dostoevskian to me as well.
Yeah, it's also connected with language, isn't it, and how you talk about yourself. And the word wstyd in Polish, I mean, I've translated it as shame, but it is that, but it's also something else as well, and it's not really a good equivalent word, because it's sort of embarrassment. It's not just shame, in the sense of shame of what I've done or not done, but it's a sort of general sort of shyness and an intense embarrassment of just being what you are. And so, but he first talks about this shame, I think in the second or third subchapter of the first part, in the context of language. He's trying to find a language to talk about himself, and he can't, because, well, this, I don't want to simplify this, um, or but it's very difficult to express that it's also connected with all this, with the logic thing, um, about there being two types of language: the language that we use all the time to talk about everyday things and other people, but we can't talk about ourselves. There's a kind of barrier to that, and on the one level it's to do with shame and admitting things, admitting what we are, or not fully understanding what we are because we haven't got the language to talk about it. And this is, that I'm just referring to that second little passage, on what cannot be put into words. Yeah, I mean, if there was time, I could read a bit of that, but maybe.
Yeah, I think that would be lovely if you can find it.
Yeah, I've marked it really. Then he goes through, when he's talking about, after he's talked about the problem of the language, he then goes through various scenes in his childhood and early manhood where he was really embarrassed, or he can't explain why he behaved as he did, but he was ashamed to be as he was. But it's in that context he talks about language. Okay, this is just page 17, and stop me if I go on too long. My life is governed by the principle of shame. One gets to know the world, gets to know a language for describing the world, but does not get to know oneself. The majority of people, almost all I would say, never learn as long as they live a language in which they could describe themselves. When I say of someone that is a coward, it means I consider that he behaves in a cowardly fashion. It means nothing more, because obviously I will not look into his soul and will not find out whether he is a coward. I cannot use this language, however, to describe myself. Within the scope of my experience, I remain the only person for whom his words, actions, failings are but a pale and fundamentally random reflection of what lies beneath them, of what comprises their cause and source. The existence of this source I experience directly, whilst I am not conscious at all of certain aspects of my behaviour and receive everything in an incomplete, distorted manner. We are always the last to learn what a fool we have made of ourselves in company. Better do we know the intentions behind our actions than those actions. Better do we know what we wanted to say than what we actually said. We know who we want to be. We do not know who we are. A language exists for describing our actions because many people experience this reality and are able to discuss amongst themselves someone else's ostentatious affability or someone else's faux pas. A language for describing myself does not exist because no one except myself experiences this reality. It would be a language for one-person usage, an unutterable, unwritable language. Everyone must create it themselves. The majority of people, almost all I'm convinced, never acquire it as long as they live. At most, they repeat in their minds other people's descriptions of their own person as expressed in that derivative language, in the language of the second kind. Or they imagine what they would say in it about themselves, were they able to see themselves from the outside. In order to say anything about ourselves, they have to make themselves strangers to themselves. My life is governed by the principle of shame. I have no better words with which to tell this truth. And so it goes on, and this thing about the language of the second kind comes up quite a lot in the book, doesn't it? I mean, it comes up a lot, and all this stuff about being able to describe yourself and how you perceive yourself, it's all interconnected again with the question of existence and do I exist? And in this first sentence of the book, he's saying, well, I realised I didn't exist. And so this then comes back to the whole problem of how the language that he uses to talk about himself, which again is a massively difficult linguistic problem to translate. And that is again interconnected with the issues to do with free choice, summer, the world of free choice, the world of multiplicity, and the world of necessity, which is the world of the ice. So, it's all these things are interconnected and
Yeah, do you want to talk, Ursula, a little bit about how the narration changes from first person to this more impersonal first person?
Okay, so this is something that Jacek has invented, but it's something that is grammatically possible in Polish. What happens is this, as he starts to get influenced by the ice, as he starts to change himself, he begins to question everything to do with how he perceives himself, to the extent that he asks himself, well, do I exist? And the first chapter, that's chapter 1, which takes place in Warsaw, so that's about the first 60, 70 pages. It's a normal first person narrative. So he is a man. the whole thing is a first-person narrative. We have to remember that, even though the grammatical structure changes, it's always from his perspective. Everything is from his perspective. Everything is filtered through his mind. So, when he's describing the past, he uses past tense endings which are marked masculine, because unlike in, well, they decline. In Polish, they decline, as they do in Russian, but in Polish, they also decline by person. Yeah, so you have these endings which end in the LEM, which indicate that it's a first person male narrator. Okay. Towards the end of that chapter, the very end of that chapter, it changes. And then most of the rest of the book is in this new form of narration, but about 100 pages from the end of the book, when a massive event happens, which we won't be spoilers about, his consciousness changes again, or his perception of himself changes again, and he starts to exist. And he goes back into that form. So, in fact, it's quite structurally quite well balanced, because, the first, 70 pages or so and the last 100 pages or so are in this normal first-person narrative. Right. So the rest of it, he tries to make, or he makes the narrative voice, which is always Benedykt, he makes it impersonal by using not a first-person verb form, but a third one. So he's a third person neuter ending and makes it reflexive. So he's using the Polish reflexive particle się, which behaves similarly to siat in Russian, but with Russian reflexive verbs, it's always attached to the verb. In Polish, it can move around the sentence a bit within certain limits. And this is normal. This is a normal, form of a verb. Lots of verbs are reflexive and they have this się. So when you put it in a third person neuter form, it can act as a kind of passive voice, or it can act as emphasizing an action without assigning specific subjectivity. So it's almost as though he's saying, well, instead of I drank, drinking was done, yeah, or thinking was done, or an act of thinking happened. So in German, you get this man with an ma, a single, a man, and it's that kind of structure. Although there's already also a subject there, man, but it's that kind of impersonal sort of narrative. But I couldn't use one. I couldn't use that equivalent because it happens 20, 30 pages times on a page sometimes, and you can't. It would just be dreadful stylistically. Couldn't do that, yeah? So I had to come up with some kind of form which would convey the meaning that this action had been done without assigning any subjectivity. So one can't use I pronouns. So I can't use I or me. Yeah? So I went through various possibilities, like using gerunds and whatever, and I decided that didn't work because it interfered too much with the usual use of a gerund. I took the infinitive. I took the semantic element of the infinitive. So drink, go, think, freeze. And there's a lot of that in the book, So it has no person, no subjectivity, but in English it had to then mean that it had no tense either, because if I used a tense, then that could indicate some other character, so I had to indicate in some way this is the narrative voice. So I reconstructed the sentences so that this voice came at the beginning of the sentence, and it would be an impersonal form. um, just a semantic element. It had to be short to preserve the energy of the text. Couldn't have some long-winded phrase repeated and repeated and repeated. And it sounds a bit like an imperative. It's not an imperative, but in a lot of cases it does sound like an imperative. And certain the critics that have written about it so far have noted that. But it actually does work because I think it works because Benedict doubts who he is. He doubts that he exists. So this is almost as though he's being prompted and told to do something, yeah? So I think, it sort of works. It's not ideal. It's not ideal. It's not an exact translation. But then in English, we don't have a reflexive particle, so we can't do it. So, but you see, it feels odd to start with. But it feels odd in the Polish, this usage of this form.
I personally think it works very well. It leads me to a question, and a kind of a boring procedural question, perhaps, but how how did this translation unfold for you? Did you dive right in and then realize that there was a problem and had to figure out how to solve for those problems and start all over again, or did you have to grapple with these core issues that you raise in your translator's postscript uh, before you even started the translation?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that I read the whole book before I started the translation. I mean, the thing is, it was very curious how this all happened because I bought the book when it first came out because I read a fantastic review of it and I bought it and I read about 100 pages, but then it just sat around, So it was 10 years later when Jacek came to the London Book Fair and Head of Zeus signed it without a translator. So they then looked for a translator and there was a competition. And I put myself forward because I thought, actually, it was that summer that I then read the whole thing. And I read it with a translation in mind. So I was thinking, well, what are the problems? So there were four main problems. Four main problems. One was this narrative with Shen. The other was the vast number of archaisms. And then there was the Russians, all the Russian, and how I was going to deal with that. And then the neologisms. Yeah, so I made quite copious notes when I went through, so I knew that these were the areas that I really needed to solve, or at least have a good idea about before I started it.
Yeah.
Because, as I said to you, I did not want to. I mean, normally a lot of translators they do a rough draft, then they go back to the beginning and start working on it more detail. No, I can't. I wouldn't. I'd have a breakdown if I had to do that. Go back to the beginning. I thought, well, I'll do it chapter by chapter, section by section, and when these sort of things came up, like words that were really quite key needed to be resolved, we kept returning to them in different contexts, like this Jedyna Pravda, the sole truth. That was quite an interesting how I arrived at that. Sole truth. There's the Pravda boy, which I translated as the truth joust, which is that wonderful scene later on where he has all these religious people who believe that they had the secret of truth, and they all get up one by one and proclaim. Yeah, and it's a kind of fight, Pravda boy, and it took me a long time to think about that, and I thought, oh, it's a bit like a tournament, isn't it? It's a bit like a jousting match. Yeah, so there were things like that, and what we were going to call Tesla's machines, for example. We've got the flow generators, we've got the Teslastic dynamo, and because you asked about Tesla in your email. Tesla was quite an important character in this. And of course, he never went to Russia, but there are mentions all the way through of things that he did do and machines that he did create, like the coil, um, and the death ray. These were things that he did actually create. So what Jacek is doing is creating other things, other machines, that do different things, in the same spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, um, but I mean, I didn't sort all that before. I mean, I started. The thing is, it's also important that when you start translating, it's like writing. When you start translating, then things start to happen, things start to occur, and yeah. So this is why I had to go over it all over and over and over again. But when I got halfway through, we were taking so long. I said to Jacek, right, from this point on, I'm going to give you one chance. So I sent him from midway through chapter 8, I think, or even from the beginning of chapter 8. He didn't see it hundreds of times. He only saw it once until it came to the final stage when he did have some comments again. But yeah, because I just had to cut down the time.
Yeah, it's an enormous book, and yeah, I it's so many technical issues as you describe them. And maybe the audience will indulge me because I have to say that although the plot is fascinating and the idea of this impact event and how it changes the climate and the search for the father and all of these political and commercial machinations are very fascinating. But for me, I'm not going to stick with a book unless it's the language. And I want to commend you and Jacek, of course, for just some gorgeous prose. And uh, I picked a passage here. It's on page 469, and this is when Benedykt gets off the train in Irkutsk, and he purchases his first pair of frosto glazed spectacles. So I'll just read a little bit of this. Everything was suddenly injected with color, as if someone had removed a thick, dark veil from a brightly colored painting. No object was any longer only white, and no object any longer only black, whilst many naturally colored things changed hue with every movement of the head, every twitch of the eyes. And this happened not in sudden jumps, like with blinking, but in keeping with the movements of merch, with the flow of oil. Colors combined, merged, mixed, flooded, and dislodged each other, squeezing out of shape like juice pressed out of fruit. Glance at the travelers. Colors, colors, colors. Glance at the sky above the transparent roof. Colors, colors. Glance at the hands, at the feet, at the mud on the floor, underfoot. Colors. And then you go on further in the paragraph. Exit down the blue marble staircase into the square outside the station. Colored sour cream hung in the air, drifting in vast streams that filled the square, streets and spaces between buildings to the height of the second story. The rainbow light of the nearest street lanterns, burning here evidently night and day, scarcely penetrated the milky suspension. People walked into and out of it like underwater shapes, looming and disappearing in clouds of silt above a riverbed. Hurrying sleighs sped across the square, leaving a wake of slow whirling eddies and vanishing into the cream. It's just so beautiful.
And that reminds me of one image that I thought he comes up several times in with the fog, yeah, where in this freezing fog, where the almost the past is recorded because people walk through it and they leave their image behind them. And I thought that
Yes,
was absolutely that was magnificent, that image. Yeah.
it really was the void, and like seeing things pass through the void that the that cleared the fog. And yeah, that was a wonderful image. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean this was the things that I loved most about the book. I think were these. with these amazing descriptions of, I mean, when he gets out into the forests as well, and the world of Siberia, particularly later after the event, when he's wandering around Siberia. I mean, and people have asked me about climate fiction, and I am a bit, it's a bit difficult to talk about this because Jacek is quite clear that he had no climate agenda. He's not drawing your attention to the fact that, oh God, we've got global warming and this is what is happening. But, as I was translating those bits about the frozen landscape and about the permafrost, I had been watching videos and seeing TV programs about the melting of the permafrost. And it's actually, while he's describing a world which is even more frozen than it was, at the moment, Siberia is melting. And some of the things that he anticipates are actually happening now with the melting.
Yeah.
The ground shifting, the bumpy airstrips, the crooked buildings, and the life. I mean, the insect cloud. I mean, I can remember there was one of our BBC reporters. He was reporting from Siberia last summer or the summer before, and he was all covered in, mosquito protection stuff because he was out there, and it was just all these insects which have been hidden in the ice for hundreds of thousands of years. They're now melting, and so he doesn't. It's not a climate change novel, but it's very, very insightful about what could happen.
Yeah, I agree. Well, before I let you go, and you've been so generous of your time,
No, it's okay. My pleasure.
we shared an appreciation that we have for another Polish novel called The Doll by Borisov Prus. And it seems to me that perhaps people in the US don't know very much about Polish literature. And I'm wondering if there are other authors or books that you think that we really should know about.
Well, before I answer that, I just point out to you that the Polish Cultural Institute in New York does do a regular series called Encounters with Polish Literature.
Oh,
And it's been running for 3 years now, and it's run by a former professor called David Goldfarb, and it's supported by the PCI New York. And they've recently also, because of the situation, they've also included some Ukrainian writers as well. I've already done 2 sessions with him in the past, and we are due to do one on Dukaj. So just there is that, but it's geared largely towards, well, it's anybody can watch it, but it's geared primarily towards university students, yeah. But so there is that, but yeah, I think as in Britain, um, there are people that know about these literatures, and majority of people don't, and they focus on the big ones, French, German, Russian, and these lesser known languages, lesser known, tend to be confined to people that come from that background themselves. I mean, I don't, and two other major translators from Polish, Bill Johnston and Antonio Lloyd Jones, also do not have Polish background, but we're the exceptions really. So I'm all for doing something like this. Were we to do Bruce, I would need to reread that because I haven't read it for a few years, but there's an enormous amount we could say. There's another writer, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, called Władysław Reymont, who wrote a well-known novel called The Peasants, and a new translation was done of that a couple of years ago. It's also quite chunky, by another British translator, Anna Zaranko. So that might be one you could consider at some point. As for myself, I mean, I'm very happy at some point if we want to have a discussion about dull, I'm very happy to do that at some point, but I would need to reread it first. Um, I have gone back to doing what I was doing before I did ICE, which is to translate women from the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 1930s. So I have a translation I'm just finishing now for Pushkin Press called Cudzoziemka. It means the stranger or foreigner. I mean, that decision on the title has still been taken. But it was originally published in 35. There was a translation of it, a not very good one, in 1944, one that missed out a lot of stuff. So we're redoing it. So that is coming out by a writer called Maria Kuncevichova. And then I'm also working on two more novels by a novelist I've already translated and published called Zofia Naukowska. Now, of the 20s, in the 1920s, in my opinion, and this is, my opinion, which, others might oppose, that one of the best period of Polish literature, I think, is from about 1900 to 1950. There's a lot of really good writers and texts and things that not been translated. Some of them have, but you know what happens often is these things get translated, and there's a lot of fanfare, and a few events, a little conference or bookshop talks or whatever, and then it just falls away again.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult for Polish authors to break through this. I mean, Tokarczuk, of course, has done so with the Nobel Prize, but it's very difficult. Bruno Schulz is another one.
Yeah.
So we'll see whether Dukaj does, because the thing is, it's very interesting that this is. I would say it is a literary work. It is a work of literary
Absolutely.
fiction. Yeah. But it also appeals to the sci-fi market. So it'd be interesting to see how how it is received, because in Britain so far there haven't been that many reviews. There've been about 10, and apart from the Guardian, which loved it, the most positive reviews have been from the sci-fi press.
Hmm.
They have
I think I
understood it
saw
better.
it on some roundups in the British press of like best science fiction novels of 2025 since it came out, I guess in November there.
Yeah, I mean, it was Guardian Book of the Day on Christmas Day,
Wow.
and that was a nice review by Stuart Kelly. There's since been one in a science fiction reviewing journal called Locus by a man called Neil Harrison, and that was very, very insightful. He really did understand the book. It was well received in the Financial Times, um, the Daily Mail. Oh, and
The car.
New
Yeah.
Scientist had a roundup of yeah. So I mean, the thing is, it's perhaps a bit early to expect too many because it's such a long book.
Yes. Yes.
People have to, if they're going to do a serious review, you've got to read it really. Um, but I'm interested to see how it's received in the States, and whether the fact that I write in British English has any impact on that. You don't
I,
think so? You
I,
don't think
I,
so because it's
no.
I've aimed at that earlier period
Yes. Yes.
to make it
Absolutely.
sound as though it was originally written in the 1920s or something.
It feels like it's written like a Henry James novel to me.
Great. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Super. Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah. Um, and I will say that Jacek is very active on Instagram. And so I feel like the book world here is talking about this book. I don't know how many people have started reading it or have finished it, but um, it's out there in the zeitgeist at least.
Good. Well, thanks. Thanks for helping to publicize it.
Well, absolutely. And Ursula, thank you for joining me today and talking about um, this wonderful book and your Herculean task of of translating it. It's a marvel.
Well, it got me through COVID. It got me through. It got me through the lockdown. I was sitting here, just getting on with it, much more worried about, certain phrases than I was about getting ill. So,
Well, that's
it
definitely making
I,
lemonade out of lemons.
yeah.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Goodbye.